Dream a little dream of me.
Welcome kindreds, it's Jessica and this is the next instalment in the Astrology for Witches series that I'm making here on my channel. We have covered a lot. We have covered where all the planets are in your chart, we've covered the signs, we've covered the houses, and so now it's time to turn our attention to the relationship between the planets in your chart. So this is where we're going to start talking about aspects. Aspects are a fairly recent addition in astrology. When you think that astrology has been happening for thousands of years, aspects is something that has only been considered really in the last few hundred years. So it's not super recent, but it's something that wasn't done before. So it's adding another layer of understanding. And what is interesting about the aspects is that it can give us a more idea of how our planets, particularly like we've been talking about in the last one, how those planets are like working together or working against each other. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. Somebody in one of my last videos left a really interesting comment saying trying to talk about like an analogy for the houses, signs and planets and how you can think about it. And she came up with an analogy which is really lovely. It's as if your chart as a whole is your house, and then the signs are rooms in your house, and they are decorated differently according to the kind of flavour and aesthetic of that sign. So your Libra room would be very on point with taste, everything. You'd probably be quite classic, quite symmetrical, and nothing too garish or flashy, whereas your Sagittarius room would likely be very bold and vivid, and there would be lots of objects from your travels in there, that kind of thing. And that, I thought this was a really fun way of kind of getting to know the signs more as well, to think about them in that idea of a kind of style of decor. That's something that it would be really fun to do. And then she said that the planets then are like people who inhabit those rooms. So your Mars might be in your bathroom, which is your Cancer room, Do you see what I mean? So you can kind of think about it like that. And I thought this was a really cool way of looking at it, and does help, especially analogies are really helpful when we're learning, because it can kind of help for things to stick in our minds like that. But the only kind of tweak that I would make to it is that your chart is more like, instead of it being like one house, it is more like a kind of like a town, I guess, or a village, a town really, or even a city, depending on the person and their chart. And rather than it being like a room which is decorated in a certain style, certain signs would match up better to certain types of buildings. So like, Taurus might well be like a temple, or perhaps even a gym. And although I guess Mars would be like a CrossFit gym. Taurus, I suppose, would be better as like a spa, like a beauty spa, where you can have really luscious treatments for your body. And Gemini would be probably an office where you could like work and communicate and chat to other people. Sagittarius might be like the travel agent. Do you see what I mean? Is that kind of thinking about it like that? And then also with the planets in those signs, then you can think about them, and the houses too. The houses, like I say, is the type of building, and then the signs is what the building's like, and then the planets are the people who kind of work or live in those buildings. And some people are very happy in their work. Like if you did have, say, Mars in Aries, so like your Aries building might be like a martial arts studio. Your Aries building could be a martial arts studio, a dojo. And Mars, if your Mars is there in Aries, then that would be a very homely, Mars would feel very at home in that place, he would be comfortable there. Whereas, or like if you put Mars over then like in Scorpio, which would probably be like a church of some kind, Mars would also feel at home there if it was quite grand and quite, you know, he would enjoy the funerals and the pomp and circumstance of it, the kind of the ritual aspect, I guess, of that. Whereas if you took Mars and put him in the school, you know, the Gemini school or the Libra school, then he would not enjoy that. Do you see what I mean? And so today, when we're talking about the aspects, you could also think about, you could kind of extend that analogy out and think of the planets in aspect to each other being like, perhaps you've got two or more planets in one house, and so they will be in the same building, or, you know, in the same sign and in the same building, and so they might get on really well together, which would be great, but one of them might be very at home, one of them might not be. And that is the kind of thing that we're looking at with the aspects. Or perhaps you have a certain building on one side of the street, and then across the street there is another type of building, and the planets that live in those or work in those buildings don't like what is going on across the road. They're like, oh, look at that across the road, that's just crap, you know, that shouldn't be happening, that kind of thing. So just kind of hold that idea, that kind of analogy at the back of your mind in case it's helpful. And if you come up with your own analogy, that would be cool as well. Please do share in the comments, because I think the more ways to think about this, the better, because it sometimes you've got to sling a lot of mud for it to stick. And with astrology, there's so much information, it can become so overwhelming that anything that can help is brilliant. So yeah, please do share if you've got your own way of thinking about it. So like I said, today we're going to talk about the aspects. That was kind of a little bit of a preamble, but I'm hoping that is going to be useful when it comes to talking about these now. I'm only going to talk about 2 of the aspects today, because I'm going to break them down the same as I've been doing with the planets, because otherwise it's just all a bit too much and confusing, and you're starting to look at too many things at the same time. So today I'm just going to talk about conjunction and opposition, and like the names themselves are a really good indicator of this. A conjunction is when you have 2 planets really close to each other. For the major planets, the sun and the moon, I know they're not really planets. In astrology we talk about them as planets, and for the personal planets as well. Different astrologers will allow for a bigger amount of space around a planet to be, and still call it a conjunction. Let me try and explain that in a better way. So like, you know, in each of your houses, we've done whole sign, whole house. If you go back and look at how I talked about that earlier on, that's kind of the most simple way to work out your chart to start off. And each of those signs then, and each of those houses will have 30 degrees in them, because you've got a 360-degree circle split into 12. So that means we've got 30 degrees for each of those houses. So you might have a planet right at the start of one house in like the 2nd or 3rd degree of that house, and then you might have a planet right at the end of that house, like in the 25th degree or something like that of that house. Even though those 2 planets are in the same house, so they're living in the same space, and if you think about that building analogy again, they're in the same building, but they're not like right next to each other. So like, say they were in a school, then perhaps one of them is like a teacher and one of them's a caretaker, and they don't have to like really work together too much, even though they occupy in the same space, if you see what I mean. Whereas if the planets are actually in conjunction with each other, which usually means within 5 degrees really, for like I say, for the bigger ones like the sun and the moon, you would allow 10 degrees. Different astrologers will say different stuff. Some will say 7, some will say 12, you know, it varies. But if they're within 5 degrees of each other, then that is a particularly, you know, they are together, so they would be in the same room of that building. And the closer they are, they might literally be sharing a bed, you know. So the tighter the conjunction, obviously, the tighter the connection of those planets, the more they're going to affect each other. Do you see what I mean? And then the further away they are, the less of an impact they have, because they're not having to be so close together and in each other's space, if you see what I mean. And like we already talked about a little bit when talking about that analogy of the rooms and the town, one of those planets might be much more at home in that space than the other planet. There are lists you can find online of like where certain planets are at home, where they are exalted or dignified, or where they are in fall, which means like where they don't like to be, basically. So you can look that up for each of the planets and work it out. Also, sometimes, you know, you might have 3, you might have 4 even planets in a conjunction, you know, all kind of sitting really, really close together. So imagine that's like a family all living in that same space, all with their different personalities, all with their different levels of comfort for being in that space, in that particular house, in that particular sign. And so you can kind of work out, well, who is going to come out on top there, judging by who is most comfortable in that place, who is most comfortable in that sign, in that house. And also, you know, if one of those planets is your ruling planet, like we talked about when we were talking about the different planets, that ruling planet will have more oomph in your chart than other planets. So the conjunction is that. And sometimes the energies work really well together. Like if you've got, say, Venus and Jupiter together, then that's great. You've got the two benefics, the two kind of planets of loveliness together, and so they tend to bring lots of good things into that area of your life, because remember that house is like the area of your life. If you have like planets with opposing natures, so if you have like say, let's say Mars and Jupiter, say, so they're not like completely opposing, like you could say Mars and Saturn are even more opposite from each other, but with Mars and Jupiter, you've got Mars, which can be kind of very forceful and aggressive, but with Jupiter next to it, kind of making everything, smoothing everything over, and making everything very generous and lovely, and not so much lovely, generous, and like people will take your Mars tendencies in that area in a better way, because they'll see it as you're kind of trying to do something for the greater good. Do you see what I mean? If you've got Jupiter sitting there with Mars. Also as well in your chart, like when you think about how the planets are all moving around the sky and things like that, when you have a conjunction, those planets will either be in the process of moving towards each other in the sky, you know, obviously not actually towards each other because they're in their own orbits, but from our point of view on Earth, when we are viewing them, they might look like they're moving closer together. In which case, obviously, they're kind of approaching each other. So think about that, what that means. Or they could be in the process of separating from each other. And so people talk about like kind of applying aspects or separating aspects as well. So that does change the energy a little bit. That's probably like, you know, if you're starting to talk about things like that, you get into definitely more intermediate astrological territory, which you don't really need to think about. I don't know if on astro.com they give you that information, but there are definitely certain apps that do. If you want to check out Time Nomad is a really good one, which gives you that applying and separating if you want to look into that. You definitely don't have to. The main thing that you're looking at is like, have I got planets sitting really close together? What does that mean? Is one of those planets more prominent than the other? If so, is that useful or is that difficult? Sometimes one of the planets will be like kind of in the shadow of the others. So like, you know, if you've got Jupiter sitting there, maybe that's not the best example actually, because Jupiter nearly always gives like a positive spin on whatever other planet is there. But if you've got, say, Venus sitting there, sitting pretty, you know, and kind of doing all the good stuff, but then perhaps you've got Mercury there as well, but it's kind of being overshadowed a little bit. So perhaps if that was happening in Libra, say, where Venus is very strong at home in Libra, then the diplomacy and kind of wanting to smooth things over and everything to be lovely might outweigh the need to actually communicate fairness. So you might be inclined to kind of tell white lies rather than tell the truth, you know, the kind of the more harsh truth. Do you see what I mean? So Mercury in Libra would be speaking the truth. It wouldn't necessarily be as that diplomatic as Venus in Libra. The Venus and the Mercury would work pretty well together to make you diplomatic, but it might also hold you back from expressing the truth when it's not pretty. Do you see what I mean? So think about the relationships between those planets. Think about the characters of those planets and how they might interact with each other, and then you start to get a really good understanding of what it means if those two planets are occupying the same space. Like I said, if you've got 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 or 6, you know, if you've got a real bunch up of them all together, that's called a stellium. And Diane, Indigo Moon Woman, she's got a big stellium in Leo, and you know, that's really interesting to pick apart as well, because you've got a whole bunch of planets all kind of sitting on each other's laps, and you've got to work out the kind of pecking order, and if you have got a planet that's in more shadow, then sometimes you can work with the energy of that planet to be able to use the good things that that planet has to offer as well, and not just always kind of default to your kind of best planet. Do you see what I mean? In that situation, there is definitely, when you have a conjunction, it can be really positive. It gives more, it's like a united front, you know, especially, like I say, if you've got 2 really helpful planets working together, or if you've got Jupiter with something giving it a good lucky expression, you know, a kind of positive expression, then that's great. But it can mean that the other planet gets kind of sidelined a little bit, you know, like if you imagine it's a couple, and the one in the couple is the kind of gregarious, lovely one who everyone thinks is really charming. And then the other one might also be really interesting, but people don't always get to see their personality, especially perhaps if it was something like Neptune, and they might be a little bit more withdrawn, a little bit more, you know, they'll have all this kind of stuff going on, but until you can kind of get to know them without that Jupiterian spouse, you don't get to tap into those qualities. So look at that in your chart and see if there are any kind of latent in shadow qualities which you could bring out. Sometimes you want things to be slightly more in shadow. Well, you know, I say you want to, you might not want to, but sometimes it's easier to leave certain things in shadow, especially things like if you've got Mars there with another planet. You may well want to embrace the energies of that other planet, especially if that other planet has got easier energies than Mars. But that doesn't mean your Mars goes away. Mars is still there. You know, you've got to work with that assertiveness and kind of bring that out in a way that is useful and helpful. So I've noticed this video is getting really long already. So let's talk about the other opposition, the other aspect, which is opposition. So conjunctions when they're all kind of together, and then opposition is when they are literally, as the name suggests, opposite. So they're in opposite signs, opposite houses. So the way it works in astrology, you know, it's like a pizza or a pie. It's sliced up into 12 chunks. We've got equal slices because we're talking about equal whole signs, so that makes things easier. We've got whole signs, whole houses. So like, you know, your Capricorn's always going to be opposite Cancer. So if you've got any planets in Capricorn, you've got planets in Cancer, then they're going to be opposite each other. But they might not, you know, we talked about those 30 degrees. If you've got if they're both like right in the middle of those signs, then they would be forming a more exact opposition from each other. They might be in the same degree, you know, they might both be at 15 degrees of that sign, right in the middle. But if you've got one that's like in 2 degrees of Capricorn and then one that's in 2 degrees of Cancer, then they're not going to be forming an exact line across. You know, do you see what I mean, across your chart? So if you've printed out your chart from astro.com, you'll be able to see these lines. They're drawn out as, there's red lines, if I remember rightly, on astro.com. So conjunctions will be like little fat lines around the edge, because obviously the planets are together, so it's just like a little line joining them up. Whereas an opposition will be like a line going poof across your chart like that, and you'll be able to see it. And also if you look in the little table down the bottom, it will say op for in the little planet chart, so you'll be able to see, and you'll be able to see how the more exact the opposition, the more influence it's going to have on you. Whereas the more kind of you know, if it's a bit further out from each other, they're not exactly opposite each other, then it's not going to have the same effect. And exactly the same as we're talking about the planets, it's like if you are opposite somebody and then it's like you're sitting on a bench and somebody's sitting on a bench looking right at you. That's how it is in your chart. I suppose you're sitting in your house, they're sitting in their house, and you're looking right out at each other. And that, it could be like you're looking out at each other and you're like, hey, you know, and you get on really well, and that's cool. And then that energy is useful, and it's like you can kind of bounce things off each other, and you can bring things. It's a good way of, you know, you can generate ideas, it can generate interest in your life, that kind of thing. But if you've got kind of more difficult planets, like if you've got Saturn in opposition with something, then that is going to make it harder. So, you know, you're like, hey there, you know, you might be Mercury, say, sitting in Gemini having a great old time, and then you've got Saturn sitting opposite you in Sagittarius not enjoying being there, like this, you know, like, I can't wait for this literally to end, I can't wait for death. So that energy then is a lot more difficult to work out. So yeah, and like I said, the more exact the opposition, the more that effect is going to be, like, you know, like literally eye to eye if you're exact. Whereas if it's not quite exact, if the way your signs, the way the planets fall within the houses means they could be like just slightly to the right or slightly to the left, so you're not quite staring them, quite eyeballing them, if you see what I mean. So yeah, conjunctions and oppositions, you can't really say that they are positive or negative. You know, people often ask, oh, is a conjunction a good thing? Is an opposition a good thing? And there's no yes or no answer to that. It depends on what the planets are that are forming that aspect, and how they work together, and how happy they are in their existing house and sign that they are occupying. Do you see what I mean? So I'm going to leave it there today. For homework, have a look in your chart at your conjunctions and your oppositions. Don't worry about any other crazy lines and stuff like that yet. We will talk about the other aspects as we carry on moving through this series. And just look at conjunctions, oppositions, look how tight the conjunctions are, because like I said, the tighter they are, and the same with oppositions, the more exact they are, the more influence they're going to have. And try and work out who's the top dog here, who's having the most influence, and also look out for any areas where there might be some untapped influence that's kind of being railroaded by a more prominent planet, if you see what I mean. So that is it for today. Let me know if you have any thoughts, any questions, and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. Warmest blessings. I will see you very soon. Da, 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 da.